Hello friends, this is Rachna Srivastava from Lucknow. We'll talk about women today. Empowerment of women has become a clarion call in today's globalized world. India is no exception. Women, as we all know, form half the population of the world. If they are neglected, humanity is deprived of half of its energy and creativity. Jawaharlal Nehru rightly said, "You can tell the condition of the nation by looking at the status of women." The position and prospects of women in the Indian society during the last 5,000 years has undergone massive change with respect to their dreams, visions, hopes, and aspirations. The module deals with the position and status of Indian women in the past 5,000 years, divided into the Rigvedic period, later Vedic age, medieval period, British India, and post-independent India. Let's have a status and position of Indian women in the early Vedic age. The recognition of a definite relationship between a man and a woman as husband and wife forms the very basis of domestic life in a civilized society. So far as the early Vedic age is concerned, we have references in the Mahabharata and such other texts. Marriage was regarded as a sacred institution involving lifelong companionship of two loving hearts. In times of happiness as well as distress, wife enjoyed a very dignified position in the household. She was mistress of this household and enjoyed coordinate authority in all, even in religious activities. Entry of the bride was considered an auspicious event for all, including the pet birds and animals. Women were free in her movements. Summons, which are in little youth parties, were organized where she could woo her husband. Marriage was usual and not obligatory. Moving on, we see there was no reference of child marriage. Widows were allowed to remarry. Girls, like boys, underwent the Upanayan ceremony. No discrimination was made on the grounds of imparting education. As a result of this childhood education, girls also had high literary achievements. Many women were rishis or seers and also composed Rigvedic hymns. Reference of two classes of women is found in the Samhitas. Sadyodvas were girls who pursued studies till their marriage, and Brahmavadinis, these were the girls who did not marry to study for whole of their life. At places, we have reference that sons were preferred over daughters, but once born, there was no question of infanticide or ill treatment of daughters. When we see the status and position of Indian women in the later Vedic period, we find that more than 2,500 years intervened between the Rigvedic age and the close of the ancient period at around 1200 AD. There was a steady decline and several negative changes were witnessed in the position in their domestic life. Marriage before puberty came to be the general rule in order to preserve the physical purity of girls. Aim was to select a bride who should not have even dreamt of sexual love. However, the age of marriage differed. It ranged between 8 and 10. Marriage became obligatory, so no question of Brahmavadinis arose. Early marriage prevented girls from getting education beyond elementary stage. As a result, they were deprived of higher learning, especially Vedic studies. Consequently, they were unfit to perform sacrifices and various sanskaras. This decline in their level of education affected their domestic and social status negatively. Gradually, women came to be regarded as Shudras. A commentator on Narad Smriti states that since girls were declared unfit for reciting or even listening to Vedic hymns, they had no knowledge of right or wrong and hence should exceptions were no doubt there. Aristocratic families realized the importance of education and made special arrangements for their daughters. As a result of all this, domestic status of an average Indian woman changed from having coordinate authority and equal powers with husband to an obedient servant to her lord. We believed that wife should be faithful to her husband in life as well as after death. As a natural consequence, sati came to prominence. Manu's remarks are notable. Women should ever be protected and kept independence with males as father, as husband, and last as sons. At another place he writes, women are sure to get astray if they are not kept under rigid control. A passage in Atriya Brahman states, while the son is hope for the family, daughter is a source of trouble to it. Thus it is clear that in the later Vedic period, objects of sensual pleasure, they came to be looked down upon as source of all evils and the chief obstacle to salvation due to the temptations offered by them. So saints and ascetics were to stay away from them. One thing is notable. Despite such degradation, women enjoyed some privileges in ancient India. Women were not to be killed due to any reason whatsoever. Daughter of a patit was not a patit though his son was. Women had to perform only half the prayashchit that men had to undergo for the same lapse. Parda system had not come into vogue, and mothers occupied a very high position, and it was frankly admitted that she was highest of all gurus, exceeding 100 fathers. Mothers. Now we see the ideal and position of Indian women in social life, that is the early Vedic period. Before discussing the position of India's women's social life in the early Vedic period, it must be kept in mind that while today social status generally depends upon education, wealth and political on religious privileges and disabilities, we know that women were highly learned and no religious disabilities were attached to them in the early Vedic period. They could compose and recite hymns, offer sacrifices and sanskaras with their husbands. So they enjoyed a high place in the society. They enjoyed coordinate authority with them. In fact, there is a reference of two religious ceremonies, Sita sacrifice at harvest and Rudra sacrifice to ensure fecundity among cattle could be performed only by women. Wars were frequent in those days. Women being physically weaker do not figure as kings or rulers in this period. Women engaged in some kind of economic activity, but it was limited to making bows and arrows, weaving cloth, making baskets and doing agri-work. So we see that women were not parasites. They were useful, wealth-producing members of society. Joint families prevailed. Daughter was allowed to inherit the property of her father. If she was a spinster. But widows could remarry. On the whole, it can be said that women enjoyed a high and respectable social status in the early Vedic. Now we'll discuss the social status in later Vedic period. Society had undergone several changes by then. Aryans had come to India. The natives were left with little work and cheap labor was available as a result. Tasks of making bows and arrows or agri-work, erstwhile performed by women, became economically dependent on their menfolk, which lowered their status. Aryans became supreme. As there was little resistance from the natives, they became more pleasure-loving. Consequently, marriage age of boys and girls began to be lowered. On the other hand, Pandits had become highly rigid. Vedic literature was canonized. Gist was no more considered important. Exact knowledge and pronunciation of the verses gained prominence. This in turn required deep and longer period of learning, which was rather impossible due to early marriages. Women's education suffered a setback. It proved fatal for their social status and position. A natural consequence is that uneducated girls began to be married at the tender age of 10 to 12. They had no voice in the choice of their husbands. Salmons gradually disappeared among the commoners. Narrow-mindedness crept in, and the concept of cruel mothers-in-law intolerant towards their daughters-in-law came into existence. Thus women became helpless, illiterate, narrow-minded and peevish in the later Vedic period. Adjustment became the key word, and we have examples of Sita, Draupadi, Sati, and Savitri. Now we see the position and status of women in the medieval age. With the advent of Muslims, the Indian society underwent drastic changes. Most of these had left behind their families, and Indian women became soft targets for sensual pleasure. The worried society imposed stricter restrictions on its womenfolk. Parda system became fairly well grounded in northern India in the higher sections of Indian society. Elderly menfolk in their family, like father-in-law, elder brother-in-law, could not confidently recognize their daughter-in-law. Criminal assault worsened the situation. The intruders, conversion of men and women, which added to the miseries of women. However, an average woman led a life of contentment in her three Ks, that is, kitchen, kids, and knitting. She was fondled by her parents, loved by her husband, and revered by her children. The main importance of Indian women in this period was that she was the fountainhead of Indian culture, spreading to its future generations. The medieval period also gave birth to several heroic Rajput women like Sanyogita, Rani Padmini, Tarabai, Kurmi Devi, Rani Durgavati, and so on. Bai was one of the foremost exponents of the Bhakti cult and an inspired poetess. Ramanand, Kabir, and Chaitanya thronged in the spirit. Now we move on to the status and position of women in modern India. Modern India was witness to several changes. In the social sphere, a number of reform movements led by reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekanand, and so on attempted at women's emancipation in a society reeling under social evils like sati, parda, child marriage, widow remarriage, dowry, etc. In the political sphere, British conquest and subjugation both improved and worsened the position of women, while liberal ideas crept in from the West and rid the society of several orthodox traditions. On the one hand, the British conquest was a sharp blow to the Indian economy, causing misery to the Indian families. Worst hit were women. To add to their woes were natural calamities like famine, poverty, and hunger, which struck the country, especially Bengal, repeatedly. Poor economic conditions, frustrated partners, and hunger pangs of children forced Indian women to lose faith in their own ancient ideals of patience, devotion, and submission, and step out of the confines of their household for a better way of existence. Several legislations brought about by the British brought further emancipation. For example, the Sarada Act of 1929 prevented girls from getting married before the age of 14. With this background, girl education received impetus and their legal position became much more strong. We have women doctors, engineers, officers, administrators, politicians, governors, as well as a woman president in the recent past. Post-independence, it was well realized that overall development of India was possible only when its womenfolk are empowered. The 73rd and 74th Amendments to the Constitution of India on 24 April 1993 were a major step in this direction. Such a strong legislation was need of the hour after centuries of deprivation and deterioration, due to which Indian women had lost her status, position, prestige, and power, leading to degradation in the development of the country as a whole. Local self-government will provide her the much required boost while she struggles to carve a niche in the society as well as in the world to bring laurels to the country and regain her lost prestige. Thank you.